The city never slept, but Marcus Wellington wished it would. At 2:17 a.m., the neon glow from towering billboards cast harsh shadows across his marble office floor, 43 stories above the streets he once knew. His reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows showed a man who had everything and felt nothing. The tailored suit couldn't hide the hollow look in his eyes, and the Rolex on his wrist only marked time he'd never get back. Behind him, framed, newspaper clippings celebrated his rise from a small-town mechanic's son to the CEO of Wellington Industries. But tonight, they felt like tombstones marking the death of who he used to be. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus had built his empire on steel and concrete, but somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten what it felt like to build something with his hands. The company's latest quarterly report sat open on his mahogany desk, numbers bleeding black ink that translated to millions in profit and thousands of layoffs. His signature at the bottom had sealed the fate of entire families, yet he felt nothing but the familiar numbness that had become his constant companion. The decision to become a rideshare driver hadn't come from some noble desire for social experiment. It was born from desperation, a last-ditch attempt to feel human again. 3 months earlier, his wife Sarah had walked out of their penthouse, taking their twin daughters with her. She'd left behind only a note that read, "You've become a stranger to yourself, Marcus. I hope you find your way back to the man I married." The silence that followed had been deafening. His therapist, Dr. Reynolds, had suggested he reconnect with his roots, but Marcus couldn't bear the thought of facing his hometown or the father he'd abandoned in pursuit of success. Instead, he'd done something that would have horrified his board of directors. He'd downloaded a driving app, purchased a beat-up Honda Civic with cash, and created a fake identity. To his passengers, he was Mike Wilson, a struggling college student trying to make ends meet. The transformation required more than just different clothes. Marcus had to shed the confidence that came with commanding boardrooms, the automatic assumption that his word was law. He practiced in mirrors, softening his voice, rounding his shoulders, remembering what it felt like to be uncertain. He studied the streets he'd stopped noticing from the back seat of his chauffeured Mercedes, learning routes and shortcuts that his GPS couldn't teach him. His first week as Mike Wilson had been a disaster. He'd stalled the Honda at red lights, fumbled with the app, and earned a string of one-star reviews. But gradually, something unexpected happened. Behind the wheel of that modest car, listening to strangers share pieces of their lives, he began to remember what it felt like to serve others instead of commanding them. The passengers came and went like chapters in a book he was only beginning to understand. There was Maria, the night shift nurse who worked 3 jobs to support her disabled mother, counting every dollar but still tipping him despite his protests. There was David, the aspiring musician who played guitar in subway stations and spoke about his dreams with a passion Marcus envied. Each ride chipped away at the walls he'd built around himself, but none prepared him for the woman who would step into his back seat on a Thursday night that would change everything. Isabella Chun had been waiting outside Metro General Hospital for 27 minutes when Marcus pulled up. The rain had started as a gentle mist but had evolved into a steady downpour that turned the city lights into watercolor smudges on his windshield. She was small, maybe 5'3", wearing scrubs that had seen better days and carrying a leather satchel that looked older than his car. Her black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and when she slid into the back seat, he caught the faint scent of antiseptic and exhaustion. "Good evening," Marcus said, checking his rearview mirror. Heading home, Isabella gave him an address in Riverside Heights, a neighborhood he recognized as working class but respectable. "Yes, finally. 28-hour shift at the hospital. I'm running on fumes and caffeine at this point." Her voice carried a slight accent he couldn't place, melodic despite her obvious fatigue. 28 hours? That's brutal. What do you do there?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious. In his previous life, he would have made small talk only if it served a purpose. Now he found himself actually caring about the answers. "I'm a pediatric oncology nurse," Isabella replied, settling back against the worn upholstery. "We had an emergency with one of our patients tonight. 8-year-old boy named Tommy. Had to stay until we got him stabilized." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "Is he okay?" "For now. Tommy's been fighting leukemia for 2 years. His family doesn't have insurance, so they're drowning in medical bills. But that kid, he never stops smiling. Makes jokes during his chemo sessions, draws pictures for the other patients. He reminds us why we do this job." As Marcus navigated through the late-night traffic, Isabella began to tell him more about her work. She spoke about children who faced death with more courage than most adults faced Monday mornings. She talked about parents who sold everything they owned to pay for treatments, about families who slept in hospital waiting rooms because they couldn't afford hotels, about medical staff who often paid for patients' medications out of their own pockets. "You know what breaks my heart the most?" Isabella asked, her voice growing softer. "It's not the kids who don't make it. They're brave, they fight until the end. It's watching their parents realize that in America, your child's life often depends on how much money you have. I've seen kids die not because we didn't know how to save them, but because their families couldn't afford the treatment." Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Wellington Industries had a charitable foundation, but it was primarily used for tax write-offs and positive publicity. He'd approved donations to museums and art galleries, while children like Tommy fought for their lives without adequate resources. "Have you ever felt powerless?" Isabella asked suddenly. "Like you're fighting a system so broken that individual kindness can only do so much." The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. He thought about the layoffs he'd approved, the healthcare benefits he'd cut to improve profit margins, the decisions he'd made from his ivory tower without considering their human cost. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I know what you mean. I became a nurse because I wanted to save people," Isabella continued. "But sometimes I feel like I'm just putting band-aids on a wound that needs surgery. The system is designed to profit from suffering, and those of us who actually care about healing are just stuck in the middle." They drove in silence for a while, the rhythm of the windshield wipers matching the beating of Marcus's heart. He found himself taking a longer route, not ready for this conversation to end. When had he last heard someone speak with such genuine passion about helping others? "Can I ask you something?" Isabella said as they turned onto her street. "You seem different from most drivers I've had. More present, I guess. What's your story?" Marcus felt his carefully constructed identity wavering. "I'm in college," he said, the lie tasting bitter in his mouth. "Business major. Driving to pay the bills." "Business, huh? What do you want to do after graduation?" The question should have been simple, but Marcus found himself struggling to answer. What did he want to do? For years, his only goal had been to accumulate more wealth, more power, more recognition. But sitting in this car, listening to Isabella talk about her purpose, he realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd done something because it was right rather than because it was profitable. "I'm not sure anymore," he admitted. "I used to think I wanted to run a big company, make."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
"Lots of money. But lately, I've been wondering if there's more to life than that." Isabella smiled for the first time since getting in the car. "That's a good question to be asking. Too many people spend their whole lives climbing ladders only to realize they were leaning against the wrong wall." When they reached her apartment building, a modest 3-story structure with flower boxes on the fire escapes, Isabella didn't immediately get out. "Mike, right?" she said, reading his fake name from the app. "Can I tell you something? In all my years of nursing, I've learned that the people who make the biggest difference aren't usually the ones with the most resources. They're the ones who pay attention, who see people as individuals rather than statistics. You've got that quality. Don't lose it when you graduate and enter the business world." She handed him a $20 bill for a $12 ride. "Thank you for listening tonight. Sometimes that's all we need, someone who actually hears us." After Isabella disappeared into her building, Marcus sat in his car for nearly an hour, staring at the $20 bill. It wasn't the money that affected him. He'd made more in the time it took to drive her home than most people made in a day. It was the fact that she'd seen something in him, some quality he thought he'd lost years ago. Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself driving more frequently, drawn to the late-night shifts when the city's most vulnerable residents needed transportation. He met home health aides finishing 16-hour shifts caring for elderly patients, food service workers, heading home from cleaning office buildings, students working multiple jobs to pay for school. Each passenger carried stories of struggle and perseverance that made his own problems seem insignificant. He began to research the hospital where Isabella worked, learning about their charity care program and the crushing debt many families faced when dealing with serious illnesses. Wellington Industries had never partnered with healthcare organizations, focusing instead on more visible charitable causes that generated positive media coverage. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic. It happened in small moments. When he helped an elderly passenger carry groceries to her door, when he waited extra time for a disabled veteran to get situated in the car, when he bought coffee for a homeless man who was trying to get to a job interview. Each act of kindness felt foreign at first, like using muscles that had atrophied from disuse. 3 weeks after meeting Isabella, Marcus was driving past Metro General when he saw her waiting at the bus stop in the rain. Her shift had ended. Late again, and the last bus had already left. Without thinking, he pulled over and rolled down his window. "Need a ride?" he asked. Isabella looked surprised but grateful as she got into the car. "Mike, what are the chances? I was about to call for a ride, but honestly, after working a double shift, I was hoping I'd get a driver I actually liked." As they drove through the quiet streets, Isabella told him about Tommy, the 8-year-old boy with leukemia she'd mentioned during their first ride. His condition had worsened, and his family was facing an impossible choice: continue treatment and lose their house, or take him home to die with dignity. "His parents are good people," Isabella said, her voice heavy with frustration. "His father works construction, his mother cleans offices at night. They've done everything right, but it's not enough. The treatment Tommy needs costs more than they'll make in 5 years." Marcus felt something crack inside his chest. What would it take? To save him, I mean. About $200,000 for the full treatment protocol, plus ongoing care, medication, follow-ups. The family has raised maybe $30,000 through fundraisers and crowdfunding. It's heartbreaking. People in their community have given everything they can, but it's not enough. When they reached Isabella's apartment, she turned to him before getting out. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't be burdening you with this. You're probably dealing with your own financial struggles as a student. It's just, sometimes I need to talk about it, you know?" "I understand," Marcus said. "I wish there was something I could do." "You already do more than you know," Isabella replied. "Just by caring, by listening. That matters more than you think." That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He paced his penthouse, looking out at the city lights while thinking about Tommy, a boy he'd never met, but whose story had burrowed into his heart. He thought about Isabella, working impossible hours for modest pay because she believed in something larger than herself. He thought about all the passengers he'd driven who faced daily struggles he'd never considered from his position of privilege. The next morning, Marcus called an emergency board meeting. His executives filed into the conference room expecting another quarterly review, but instead found their CEO looking more engaged than they'd seen him in months. "We're changing direction," Marcus announced without preamble. "I want to establish a medical fund specifically for pediatric cancer patients who can't afford treatment. $100 million to start." The room erupted in concerned murmurs. His CFO, Richard Hastings, was the first to speak. "Marcus, that's a significant commitment. What's the ROI on something like this? How does it align with our core business objectives?" "The return on investment is saving children's lives," Marcus replied firmly. "As for alignment with our objectives, I think it's time we expanded what we consider our objectives to be." His head of marketing, Jennifer Walsh, looked intrigued. "From a PR standpoint, this could be very positive. Healthcare is a hot-button issue right now. If we position it correctly, this isn't about PR, Marcus cut her off. This is about doing what's right. I want zero marketing around this. No press releases, no photo opportunities, no tax benefits. Just help for families who need it. The board members exchanged glances. They'd known Marcus for years, had watched him build the company through aggressive expansion and cost-cutting measures. This version of their CEO was unfamiliar territory. Over the following days, Marcus worked with the company's legal team to establish the fund. He insisted on streamlined processes that would minimize bureaucracy and maximize impact. Families wouldn't have to navigate complex application procedures or wait months for approval. If a child needed treatment, the fund would provide it. The first recipient was Tommy Chun. Marcus had researched the family through hospital contacts, learning that Tommy's parents had indeed exhausted every option available to them. When Isabella called to tell him that an anonymous donor had covered Tommy's entire treatment plan, her voice was thick with emotion. "Mike, you won't believe what happened," she said during their next ride together. "Remember Tommy, the boy I told you about? Someone just paid for everything. Every penny of his treatment. His parents are crying. The entire nursing staff is crying. It's like a miracle." Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter, fighting to keep his voice steady. "That's wonderful. How did it happen?" "We don't know. The money came through some kind of foundation. The family is trying to find out who did it so they can thank them, but apparently, the donor wants to remain anonymous." Can you imagine having that kind of money and caring enough to use it this way? "Yeah," Marcus said quietly. "I can imagine." Over the next several months, Marcus continued his double life with increasing complexity. By day, he ran board meetings and made strategic decisions for Wellington Industries. By night, he drove strangers around the city, listening to their stories and learning about struggles he'd never considered. The medical fund had helped dozens of families, but Marcus found that the money was only part of what he'd gained. Through his conversations with Isabella, he learned about systemic problems in healthcare that went far beyond individual cases. She introduced him to the concept of medical deserts, areas where hospitals had closed because they weren't profitable enough, leaving entire communities without adequate care. She told him about nurses who worked multiple jobs because their salaries weren't enough to live on, about medical students who graduated with crushing debt that influenced their career choices away from primary care and toward more lucrative specializations. "The thing is," Isabella said during one of their rides, "individual charity, as wonderful as it is, can't fix a broken system. We need structural changes, insurance reform, hospital accountability, medical school loan forgiveness for people who commit to serving underserved communities. But those changes require people in power to care more about health outcomes than profit margins." Her words haunted Marcus. He began to research healthcare policy, attending virtual town halls and reading reports from organizations he'd never heard of. He learned about the connection between his own industry and healthcare costs, how construction and real estate development affected hospital locations, how environmental policies influence public health outcomes, how employment practices impacted workers' access to insurance. The revelation that had been building for months finally crystallized during a conversation with Isabella about her own story. She'd grown up in a small farming community where the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away. When her younger brother had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at age 7, her family had faced a choice similar to Tommy's parents: move closer to the city for better medical care, or stay in the community they loved and risk their sons' health. "We moved," Isabella said. "My parents sold the farm that had been in our family for 3 generations. My dad went from being his own boss to working in a factory. My mom took whatever job she could find. They gave up everything so my brother could have a chance at a normal life." "Do you ever resent that decision?" Marcus asked. "How could I? It saved his life, but it also showed me how unfair the system is. Why should families have to choose between their livelihood and their children's health? Why should access to medical care depend on geography and wealth?" That night, Marcus made another decision that would have shocked his board. He began developing a proposal for medical centers in rural communities, not profitable ventures, but necessary services. Wellington Industries had the resources to build and staff clinics in medical deserts, creating a model that other corporations could follow. When he presented the idea at the next board meeting, the pushback was immediate and intense. "Marcus, this is starting to feel like a pattern," Richard said. "First the charity fund, now this. I understand wanting to do good, but we have shareholders to consider. These ventures won't generate returns." "What if we redefine what we mean by returns?" Marcus asked. "What if we measure success not just in dollars, but in lives improved, communities strengthened, systems changed?" Jennifer looked skeptical. "That's a nice sentiment, but at the end of the day, we're a business. If we're not profitable, we can't help anyone." "We're profitable enough," Marcus replied. "Wellington Industries made $800 million in profit last year. We can afford to invest some of that in projects that matter." The debate continued for hours, but eventually, Marcus's vision prevailed. The company would pilot 3 rural medical centers, partnering with existing healthcare organizations to ensure proper staffing and community integration. As the medical center project moved forward, Marcus found himself spending more time in his role as Mike Wilson. The contrast between his two worlds had become both more pronounced and more necessary. In boardrooms, he fought for policies that would benefit people he'd never meet. In his Honda Civic, he met those people and heard their stories firsthand. It was during one of these rides that Isabella shared something that would change the trajectory of his thinking once again. She'd been working on a research project about the correlation between employment practices and community health outcomes. "It's fascinating," she said as they drove through an industrial district lined with factories and warehouses. "Companies that provide good healthcare benefits, living wages, and job security create healthier communities. Their employees have better access to preventive care, their families experience less stress-related illness, and their children perform better in school. It's like good business practices create a ripple effect of wellness." Marcus thought about Wellington Industries' employment practices. The company had grown profitable partly by keeping labor costs low, limiting benefits, resisting wage increases, maintaining a large percentage of contract workers who didn't qualify for company insurance. He justified these decisions as necessary for competitiveness, but Isabella's research suggested they might be penny-wise and pound-foolish. "Have you ever tried to change things from the inside?" he asked. "Like, if you had influence at a large company?" Isabella laughed. "I'm a nurse, Mike. I don't exactly have connections in corporate boardrooms. But I've always thought that if someone with real power actually understood these connections, they could make incredible changes. Not just through charity, but through how they run their business." The seed Isabella had planted grew into Marcus's most ambitious project yet. He began developing a comprehensive benefits package for Wellington Industries employees: full healthcare coverage, childcare assistance, tuition reimbursement, mental health services. The program would be expensive initially, but his research suggested it would pay for itself through reduced turnover, increased productivity, and improved company reputation. More importantly, he began to see how individual acts of kindness could scale into systematic change. The medical fund had helped dozens of families, but changing employment practices could help thousands of employees and their families. The rural medical centers would serve entire communities, but transforming how corporations thought about their social responsibility could influence entire industries. The night before he was scheduled to present his comprehensive benefits proposal to the board, Marcus drove Isabella home from another long shift. She seemed particularly exhausted, and when he asked about her day, she told him about a colleague who'd been hospitalized with a heart attack. "Susan's been working double shifts for 3 years to pay for her daughter's college," Isabella said. The stress finally caught up with her. She's only 45, but the doctors say her heart is in worse condition than most 70-year-olds. She was so worried about the hospital bills that she tried to discharge herself early. Marcus felt anger rising in his chest, not just at the situation, but at his own complicity in creating similar stress for his own employees. What will happen to her? The hospital will work with her on a payment plan, and we're all chipping in to help with her bills. But honestly, she'll probably never be able to afford to stop working, even if her doctor says she should. That's the reality for most of us. It doesn't have to be, Marcus said quietly. Isabella looked at him curiously. What do you mean? I think there are people who could change things if they wanted to. People with resources and influence. They just need to understand the human cost of their decisions. I hope you're right, Isabella said. But in my experience, people with power tend to stay isolated from the consequences of their choices. It's easier to make harsh decisions when you don't have to look the people affected in the eye. Her words echoed in Marcus's mind as he sat in his office the next morning, preparing for the board meeting. Through his windows, he could see the city spreading out below, full of people like Isabella who worked impossible hours for modest pay, while people like his former self accumulated wealth they couldn't possibly spend. The presentation to the board was his most passionate yet. Marcus laid out not just the financial case for comprehensive benefits, but the moral imperative. He shared statistics about employee wellness, productivity, and retention. He talked about community health outcomes and corporate responsibility. But mostly, he talked about the human stories he'd heard during his months as a driver. We have an opportunity to lead, he concluded, not just in our industry, but in how American businesses think about their relationship with their employees and communities. The question isn't whether we can afford to do this. The question is whether we can afford not to. The debate was intense and prolonged. Some board members were intrigued by the potential for positive publicity and employee loyalty. Others were concerned about the immediate impact on profit margins and stock price. Richard, predictably, was the most vocal opponent. Marcus, I have to ask, Richard said during a particularly heated exchange. What's really driving this? 6 months ago, you would have laughed at this proposal. Now you're suggesting we fundamentally alter our business model based on what amounts to humanitarian concerns. What's changed? The question hung in the air. Like a challenge. Marcus could have deflected, could have talked about market trends and consumer expectations. Instead, he decided to tell the truth, or at least part of it. I've been spending time outside our usual circles, he said. Talking to people who work in different industries, face different challenges. It's given me perspective on how our decisions affect real people's lives. I think we have a responsibility to use our success to create positive change, not just accumulate more wealth. The benefits package was approved by a narrow margin, but it was approved. Implementation would begin immediately, affecting over 15,000 Wellington Industries employees and their families. Word of the changes spread quickly through the company. Marcus began hearing feedback from employees he'd barely noticed before. Maintenance staff who could finally afford their medications, office workers who could send their children to better schools, warehouse employees who could take time off when they were sick without losing pay. The most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. Carol Martinez, who cleaned the executive offices at night, approached him one evening as he was leaving late. Mr. Wellington, she said nervously, I wanted to thank you for the new healthcare plan. My grandson has asthma, and we've been rationing his inhaler because we couldn't afford refills. Now he can breathe easy, and so can I. Standing in that hallway, talking to Carol about her grandson's health, Marcus felt more satisfied than he had after closing any multi-million-dollar deal. This was what success should feel like, not the accumulation of wealth, but the improvement of lives. His transformation might have continued along this trajectory indefinitely if not for a crisis that threatened to expose his double life. Wellington Industries was bidding on a major urban development project that would require demolishing several blocks of affordable housing. The displaced residents would receive minimal compensation, not enough to relocate within the same community. During a city planning meeting, Marcus listened as community members spoke against the project. They were joined by healthcare workers from Metro General, who argued that displacing long-term residents would disrupt continuity of care for patients with chronic conditions. When Isabella stepped up to the microphone, Marcus's heart stopped. "My name is Isabella Chun, and I'm a pediatric oncology nurse at Metro General," she began. "I want to talk about how housing displacement affects the children I care for. When families are forced to move away from their support networks and familiar healthcare providers, it creates additional stress during an already traumatic time. Some of my patients have missed crucial treatments because their families were temporarily homeless after being displaced from previous developments." She spoke with the same passion Marcus had heard during their car rides, but now her words were directed at his industry, his company, his decisions. She talked about patients whose families had been priced out of neighborhoods they'd lived in for generations, about the difficulty of maintaining medical care when people were forced to move repeatedly. "We asked developers and city planners to consider the human cost of these projects," Isabella concluded. "Housing policy is health policy. When you displace families, you don't just change where they live. You change their access to healthcare, education, employment, and community support." After the meeting, Marcus sat in his car for a long time, wrestling with the implications of what he'd heard. The development project would be profitable for Wellington Industries, but it would cause exactly the kind of harm Isabella had described. As Mike Wilson, he would have opposed it. As Marcus Wellington, he was supposed to champion it. That night, he called Isabella for a ride from the hospital. During the drive, she was unusually quiet until he asked about her day. "I did something today that probably won't make any difference, but I had to try," she said. "There's a development project that would displace hundreds of families in the Riverside district. I spoke at a city planning meeting, trying to explain how housing instability affects health outcomes. Do you think it helped?" Marcus asked, knowing the answer. "Probably not. These developers have more resources and influence than a bunch of healthcare workers and community organizers. But at least I can say I try to speak up for my patients." The weight of his deception felt crushing. Here was someone who used her limited free time to advocate for others, while he sat on a board that was actively contributing to the problems she was fighting. "Isabella," he said carefully, "what would it take to change your mind about a project like that?" "Honest community engagement," she replied immediately. "Most of these developers pretend to consult with residents, but it's all for show. They've already made their decisions. If someone actually listened to community needs and designed a project that served existing residents instead of displacing them, that would be revolutionary." That night, Marcus made a decision that would finally bridge his two worlds. He would not only oppose the development project, but he would propose an alternative that addressed the community's needs while still generating reasonable returns for the company. The next morning, he shocked his development team by instructing them to halt work on the displacement-based project. Instead, he wanted them to explore options for affordable housing that would benefit current residents while still creating value for Wellington Industries. "Marcus, this is going to cost us." The contract, his head of development warned. "The city wants maximum tax revenue, and that means high-end units, not affordable housing." "Then we'll make a different case to the city," Marcus replied. "We'll show them how affordable housing with integrated community services can generate long-term value, economic stability, reduced social services costs, better health outcomes." The proposal that emerged was unlike anything Wellington Industries had ever undertaken. Instead of luxury condos, they would build mixed-income housing with on-site childcare, community health services, and small business spaces. Existing residents would have priority for the new units, and rent would be tied to income levels to prevent displacement. The project would be less profitable in traditional terms, but Marcus had learned to define profit differently. The value would come from community stability, resident health and well-being, and the precedent it would set for responsible development. When he presented the revised proposal to the board, the response was predictably mixed. "Marcus, I admire your intentions," Jennifer said, "but we're not a social services organization. We're a development company. Our shareholders expect certain returns. Our shareholders benefit from living in healthy, stable communities," Marcus countered. "This project creates long-term value that goes beyond immediate profit margins. Richard was more direct in his opposition. This is the third major proposal you've brought us that prioritizes social impact over financial returns. I have to ask, are you having some kind of crisis? Because this isn't the leader who built this company. Maybe the leader who built this company was missing something important, Marcus replied. Maybe it's time to evolve. The proposal passed, but barely. Marcus knew he was testing the limits of his board's patience, but he also knew he couldn't return to making decisions based solely on profit maximization. As the community-centered development moved forward, Marcus found himself working more closely with local organizations, including the hospital where Isabella worked. He attended community meetings as himself rather than as Mike Wilson, listening to residents' concerns and incorporating their feedback into the project design. It was at one of these meetings that Isabella first saw him as Marcus Wellington. He was presenting updates on the development when he noticed her in the audience, her face cycling through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been betrayal. After the meeting, she waited until the crowd had dispersed before approaching him. "Mike," she said uncertainly. "My real name is Marcus," he said quietly. "Marcus Wellington." Isabella stared at him for a long moment. "You're the CEO? The one who's been doing all these projects, the medical fund, the rural clinics, this housing development?" "Yes. But you've been pretending to be a college student, driving for rideshare, listening to me complain about wealthy people who don't understand real problems." Her voice was rising slightly. "How long have you been lying to me?" "About 6 months. But Isabella, everything we talked about, everything I learned from you, that's real. That's what changed everything." "Changed everything?" "Forgave. You good material for your corporate social responsibility initiatives?" The accusation stung because there was truth in it, even if her interpretation was wrong. "At first, maybe. I was lost, disconnected from any sense of purpose. Driving gave me a way to feel useful again. But meeting you, hearing your stories, learning about the problems you face every day, that opened my eyes to things I'd never considered." Isabella looked at him as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "So all those rides, all those conversations about struggling with money, wondering what to do after graduation, that was all fake?" "The financial struggles were fake. The identity crisis was real. I really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, what kind of person I wanted to be. You helped me figure that out by lying to me." Marcus felt the weight of his deception, settling between them like a wall. "I know how it looks. I know you have every right to be angry. But Isabella, the person you talked to in that car, that was the real me. Maybe the most real I'd been in years." Isabella shook her head slowly. "I don't know what to believe anymore. How do I know any of this isn't just another performance? The generous CEO who learned compassion from the common people? Because, you know me," Marcus said desperately. "You've seen me at 3 in the morning, exhausted and honest. You've heard me struggle with questions that don't have easy answers. That person exists. He's standing right here. That person was also lying to me every time we spoke." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of all their conversations hovering between them. Finally, Isabella spoke again. "I need time to think about this, about what it means, what you've done, what you're trying to do now. I can't just pretend the deception doesn't matter because you're doing good things with your company." Marcus watched her walk away, feeling like he'd lost something precious that he might never get back. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to become a better person, he'd hurt someone who had been instrumental in that transformation. Over the following weeks, Marcus threw himself into the community development project with renewed intensity. If Isabella couldn't forgive him, at least he could honor what she'd taught him by continuing the work. The housing project was becoming a model for other developers, and the medical fund had expanded to include mental health services and addiction treatment. But the success felt hollow without being able to share it with the person who had inspired it. Marcus continued driving for rideshare, partly from habit and partly from hope that he might encounter Isabella again. Instead, he met other passengers who were dealing with the systemic problems he was now trying to address through his corporate initiatives. There was David, a teacher who worked second job at a grocery store because his school district salary wasn't enough to support his family. Marcus learned about education funding disparities and began exploring partnerships with schools in underserved communities. There was Angela, a home health care aide who took 3 buses to reach her clients because she couldn't afford a car. Her stories about elderly patients who couldn't afford their medications led Marcus to expand the medical fund to include prescription assistance for seniors. Each passenger added another layer to his understanding of the interconnected problems facing working families, but none of them filled the void left by Isabella's absence. 3 months after their confrontation, Marcus was driving past Metro General when he saw a familiar figure sitting on a bench outside the emergency entrance. Isabella was there, but she wasn't waiting for a ride. She was crying. Marcus pulled over and approached her cautiously. "Isabella, are you okay?" She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "Tommy died," she said simply. Marcus felt the world tilt. But the treatment, the fund covered everything. It wasn't enough. Sometimes love and money and the best medical care in the world aren't enough. He fought for so long, and we all believed. Her voice broke completely. Without thinking, Marcus sat beside her on the bench. For a moment, they grieved together in silence. Then Isabella spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been angry at you for months. For lying, for making me feel foolish. But sitting here now, thinking about Tommy's family and how your fund gave them extra time with him, gave them hope when they had none. I realize anger is a luxury I can't afford when there's so much work to be done." Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his real business card. "I want to do more. Not as Mike Wilson, but as Marcus Wellington. I want you to help me understand. What else needs to change?" Isabella took the card, studying it for a long moment. "The rural clinic project is helping. The housing development is revolutionary. But Marcus, the problems are so much bigger than what any one company can solve. Then we find other companies, other wealthy individuals. We build a movement. If you'll have me, not as your passenger, but as your partner in this work." Isabella managed a small smile through her tears. Tommy would have liked that. He always said the best medicine was when people work together. 6 months later, the Wellington Foundation had become a coalition of corporations committed to addressing systemic inequality. Isabella served as its director of community engagement, ensuring that programs were designed with input from the people they aimed to serve. The foundation's first major initiative was a healthcare access program that combined corporate funding with policy advocacy. Instead of just treating symptoms, they worked to change the underlying systems that created health disparities. Marcus still drove occasionally, but now as himself rather than Mike Wilson. The experience had taught him that true leadership meant listening first and acting second, that the most important conversations often happened in unexpected places with unlikely teachers. During a foundation board meeting, Isabella presented data showing that their integrated approach was creating measurable improvements in community health outcomes. After her presentation, she approached Marcus privately. "Do you ever regret it? The deception, I mean. How everything started?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "I regret lying to you. I regret that my own isolation and selfishness made it necessary to pretend to be someone else before I could learn to be myself. But I don't regret the journey. It led me here, to this work, to understanding what really matters." And what's that? That kindness isn't just about individual acts of charity. It's about using whatever power you have to create systems that make kindness possible for everyone. Isabella nodded approvingly. Tommy's parents started a scholarship, fund in his memory. They want to help other families facing medical crises. They asked me to tell you that your fund didn't just help Tommy. It showed them how people with resources can choose to care. As Marcus drove home that night, he reflected on the distance he'd traveled since that first night in the rain. He'd lost his isolation and gained a purpose. He'd traded the hollow satisfaction of accumulating wealth for the deeper fulfillment of creating change. His phone buzzed with a ride request. Even though he no longer needed the income or the anonymity, He still accepted rides occasionally. Tonight's passenger was a young mother heading home from her job at a call center. During the ride, she told him about her dreams of becoming a nurse, about the financial barriers that made that goal seem impossible. Marcus listened, really listened, and began mentally designing a scholarship program for working parents pursuing healthcare careers. Some conversations, he'd learned, were too important to end with just a ride home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.